Welcome back, everybody, to the Kid-Free Weekend. I'm Jennifer.
I'm Jeff.
Hey.
Nice intro, babe.
Thanks.
That's super good. I'm jealous. Come do that on my show.
Listen, as you're introing the show, you're putting on a necklace, and I got to tell you, babe, you have your headphone cables under the necklace.
Oh.
So
Sorry.
I don't want you to choke out during the show. I think that would be embarrassing.
But entertaining.
But maybe it would get us like millions of hits. Like this lady died.
We'd be rich.
She choked herself.
You'd be rich.
I would get you a super nice grave.
Thanks.
Or urn.
Yes, an urn.
A super nice urn.
I want it made out of some kind of expensive material.
The only concern I have is that you can only do that once.
I want it made out of
That's why it's got to pay off. Kryptonite?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I'll die myself. I'll see you then because the radiation.
That would be bad, no.
Yeah, it's radioactive.
But how cool would that be? I would be radioactive ashes.
That would be amazing.
Shit.
We could start living our Fallout-inspired dreams.
Yes. Let's introduce our guest.
So, well, you introed the show. Why don't you introduce our guest?
No. This is Shaun, everybody.
I was just trying to save your life. I'm sorry. Yes, we have a guest today. This is Shaun Lau. Say hi, Shaun.
Hi. Hey. Hello.
If you listen to our show regularly, I've mentioned a number of times how I really want to talk to this dude, and we finally got our shit together enough, or at least I did, to finally have him on the show. Shaun Lau, thank you for coming on the show, and welcome.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I like your show. I like your faces, your whole human presence, and yeah, I'm glad to be here.
We like yours too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm a fan of yours through, originally found you through your podcast called No Totally, which is also your Twitter handle.
Correct.
And you are a podcaster, but also more. So, so why tell us a little bit about your podcast, and I'd like to know a little bit about the evolution of you. You started with a movie podcast with your best friend, and then you got into some other things.
I want to know what that was because I don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So tell us about that first. So movie podcast.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I think it was 2013. Me and a friend, Brian, who we used to live in the same city. We both used to live in San Diego. He had moved back home to New Hampshire. I was still in San Diego.
San Diego.
We liked talking. What?
Nothing. Nothing.
What? Sorry.
It was a movie reference, but not not a quality movie maybe.
Right. No, I couldn't hear it. I was my cat is going to make noise. I'm just letting everybody know my cat's going to make noise at some point.
It's all right.
It's entertaining. Yes.
He looks like he's about to make noise. He didn't even make noise. I just got distracted by the fact that he looks like he's about to make noise. Anyway, so Brian and I, we have fun conversations. My wife at the time had suggested that we do a podcast, and I was like, nah, who would listen to that? And, a few dozen people decided to listen to it once we started recording. There's a long version of this story, but we'll go with the short one. I got on Twitter to promote the podcast. And so for a while, I was just kind of in podcast Twitter and film Twitter. And eventually, I don't know, I started following more people who were more kind of socially aware and tweeted about, issues of social fairness and change and that kind of thing. And it became more interesting to me than discussing film specifically. So I started bringing people on to interview that were kind of more in that mindset. And we still do movies occasionally, but for the most part, and I should say we haven't released an episode in like 3 months.
It's been a while.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so that's kind of the evolution of the show. Because really, like, the name of the show, as you mentioned, it's called No Totally. Initially, we had talked about names, and a lot of names came up that included a reference to film or movies or something, and I kind of didn't want to include that in the name because I didn't want to get hemmed in to anything specific. Like I've always kind of been the kind of person where, like, I recognize that it's more interesting to hear me talk about things that I'm excited about. and I didn't necessarily know if I was going to be excited talking about film all the time. So it was always kind of left wide open to do whatever we wanted to, and then eventually what I wanted to, because I do most of the work on the show. So
sounds a lot like us.
She and I are just kind of smiling at each other here. There are many similarities. Maybe this is how all podcasts are born. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, okay, my cat is making...
What is your cat's name?
My cat's name is Boss Baby.
Boss Baby. Okay.
Boss Baby.
What, do you say Boss Baby or do you say Boss or Baby?
No, I never call him that. I call him Buddy most of the time.
Okay.
Like, hey, what's up, Buddy?
Yeah.
And if I'm talking to other people, sometimes I'll call him Boss or Baby or the Boss or the Baby.
Cute. What kind? Is he just a mutt cat?
He is. He's like one of those like half Bengal something.
Nice.
I don't really know.
So he's kind of big.
He's just a cute pain in the ass.
Okay. All right.
He always looks sad.
Well, welcome to the show, Boss Baby.
Buddy.
Boss Baby. Come say hi. Anytime I'm talking to anybody, like on the phone or whatever, if I'm talking to someone who's not here in person, he thinks I'm talking to him. And so he'll often talk back.
That's adorable. Aw.
Yeah, right now he is distracted. He's seeing phantoms and chasing them around, but once he settles down, I'm sure he will start meowing at me.
That's all right. We have a chatty cat, but we just usually don't have her in our recording room.
Yeah.
The dog will chase her away.
Yeah.
Oh, there he goes. He's meowing. Yeah, I mean, I'm in a studio apartment, so I can't
get away from
anything
him
about this cat. Yeah. Dummy. Yeah. So, and then I really don't know how to describe the whole Twitter experience. I just tweet about things that I care about, and then I write these long threads about things, and then people start following me, and then I have way more followers than I ever thought I'd ever have, and then now that's happening.
Would you call yourself an activist?
I don't know. The thing about activism is it's almost like it's hard to say what that really is beyond kind of like a job title that you give yourself. And
right.
I don't.
Well, I mean, in a general term, as a general term, as what people think of it as I think you are. I think you're an activist.
I think that, I mean, it depends, right? So like there are kind of with everything else, it really depends on the context. So if you're talking to and about people who kind of don't use a lot of their time kind of agitating for social change, then a lot of times you'll look at anyone who thinks about those issues as an activist. And I think that's a valid way of defining it. But once you start getting into these circles where, like, say you work at a nonprofit and then in your spare time you're signing petitions and making signs and marching, then you're going to define the word activist in a really different way. And I communicate with people from, like, you know, those backgrounds and kind of everything in between. And so because there's such a variable definition throughout that spectrum for what an activist is, it's kind of hard. Like, I guess what I'm saying is if I hung out with one type of person, then I would feel like it would be easier to kind of define that. But there are people who do so much, and they do things in such a way where they are, in my mind, certainly activists, and I'm like not anywhere close to what they're doing, right? Like, I'm not, for an example, I'm not kind of constantly studying critical texts on the issues that I'm thinking about, you know, gender inequality, racial inequality, that kind of stuff, and then communicating new information based on the stuff that I'm reading. I'm more so kind of using the way that I think about problems in general to think about these things that kind of flash across my Twitter timeline. And I think that provides a lot of times kind of an easy-ish, less threatening way of kind of getting into these issues. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people like the tweets, I guess, because they may see other people talk about things like systemic racism, kind of not understand what that is. And then if you look at my feed, I'm kind of pointing out examples every once in a while. I mean, that's a long-winded way of answering that question, but I think, I don't know. I don't know what I would call myself, and I don't know what it would take for me to call myself an activist either.
Let me ask you this then, as sort of a side question to that. How do you feel about the term social justice warrior? And I ask that because I feel like, and this was some comedian's joke. I don't remember what, but I've always really related to it. I'm Jewish. And some comedian once made the joke that like Jew is a word that is both like a legitimate term and also its own pejorative. Where it really just depends on how you say it or the emotion behind it. It's either like, yes, well, I'm a Jew, or that guy's a Jew. Social justice warrior, the SJW, seems to take that on as well, where like if someone called me that, I wouldn't take it as offensive. I'd be proud, actually. But a lot of people would use that in a mocking way.
Well, I think it originated as a pejorative. So I kind of see it that way. I mean, it's I don't mind it so much in the sense that it's not exactly the most hurtful thing to be called, but also it's just kind of so ridiculous. Like there are certain terms that in order to use them, you have to have a baseline level of ignorance about things. And that's one of them, you know? So I kind of like, it's just, so it says more about the person who's saying it than it does about you, you know?
Yeah, fair enough. But if someone were I've seen people use it in a good, in a good context, in a positive context.
Well, I think usually that's ironic, you know? And I don't really like that stuff either. Like one of the things that I concentrate on or think about a lot is kind of the way that language is used and the way that it evolves to become very connotative rather than just straight denoting things. And when you have a term like SJW or any of these other terms, they start taking on a life of their own. And they have their own kind of different, kind of like what you're talking about. Within a certain tribe, there's going to be an understanding of what that means, and if there's a derogatory edge to it. And outside of those groups, there's going to be a different feeling. And so you get this thing where you're all using the same terms, but they mean different things to different people, and it tends to hinder communication, I think. So even if you're using it ironically, it's not like taking that term back, reclaiming that term is doing very much. As opposed to something like, these racial slurs that have been around forever. When you see people reclaiming those, a lot of times it doesn't have anything to do with the person who's using the terms. It's about the kind of sheer sense of existential terror that they're meant to bring out when they're used against people, right? So it's important to reclaim those, because you can't live your life under that kind of fear. But with social justice warrior, it's not like you expect somebody to try to lynch you immediately after calling you that. It's just kind of
probably not
term.
There's probably a better chance of that happening, especially in Trump's America with Jew.
Right. Yeah.
I was chuckling a second ago because it gave me this flashback to something that I think about fairly regularly, but I don't know if I've ever talked about it before. And it goes back to this cartoon strip that we actually talked about, Babe, in our very first podcast, Bloom County. Mm-hmm. And I used to read Bloom County all the time, and I had all the books even, and I didn't get a lot of it. It was way above my head when I was a kid, just all the political stuff. Yeah. But one thing that hit me, and again, I didn't get it at the time, but there was this one strip where Opus, the penguin, had gotten, someone had called him a liberal. And like stuck a big old like bumper sticker kind of thing on him that said liberal. And he was trying to get it off of himself, and then the label stuck, and it just came across. Now I know, looking back, that was meant to be ironic more than anything. Like it's not a conservative comic strip, but the way that was framed has always stuck with me as like, if you call yourself a liberal, people are going to think, I don't know, you're an idiot or something like that. And that still is like in me somewhere, where I'd rather call myself maybe progressive than liberal.
Isn't that, it's so interesting because liberals base their usually information on facts. and yet and state the plain truth, don't they? I mean, isn't that a general?
Well, I think that's the goal, but I think,
ideal.
I think it's like, I feel like if I say I'm a liberal, if I'm having a conversation with someone that I don't know very well.
I know. I feel the same.
I feel like that's not a good way to go into that conversation because that person's going to
be like, oh, here we go again.
Like, I'd rather frame it a different way, and maybe there's a chance we can have a more productive conversation if I don't say I'm liberal about something.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
It's weird, isn't it?
Both those terms, I think, like liberal and conservative, I think both have become just these derogatory terms. Like they carry all this weight that you may not necessarily be trying to communicate.
And that's because we have all of these ads that we get to see during all of our, they're all slamming each other.
Oh, yeah.
It's definitely become, which one are we going to vote for that is the lesser of the two evils, which... it doesn't really even matter.
Yeah,
nothing ever changes, really.
Jeff, it's just like you said. It's a lot like saying Jew. Like it depends what the context is and what the intent of the person saying it is trying to say. Because there are actual policy stances that come with both conservative and liberal labels, as well as progressive and anything else.
Right.
But a lot of times we don't really take into account what the actual policy stances are. Because these terms have become so loaded with other things. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's frustrating, but at the same time, and I think this about a lot of issues related to kind of trying to affect the social landscape and getting people to think about these things. Like I would love for those terms not to carry all that baggage anymore, but if I tried to work on that, then it wouldn't happen in my lifetime anyway. So it's like you always end up with these. Well, I think when you're in the social justice space, you're always thinking about what issues you can take up and actually have some kind of efficacy solving or at least working towards a solution. But yeah, that is really, really frustrating because people are just like, you make an argument and then someone's like, oh, you're just a liberal. Oh, you're just a conservative. Oh, you're just, and then that kind of closes down the discussion.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And that's kind of intentional, right? Like people, like you alluded to, we don't, or like Jennifer alluded to, like it's all the lesser of two evils. So the only real way to get people to vote, like, excitedly for their candidate is to make them hate the other one so much, because it's not like you're going into the booth like, yeah, I want to vote for this person so bad. Like you're just constantly voting against the thing you like less. And so in order to do that, you really have to demonize the other side, like to the point where they're essentially dehumanized. And that's worked really, really well in this country, as we've seen.
Well, I feel like we got as deep into that as we've ever gotten. Like it's this steady downward spiral because, I mean, I can say I was not excited about Hillary. I was excited about Bernie. And then with the stuff that happened with Bernie, maybe a lot less excited about Hillary. But the thought of a Trump presidency guaranteed that I was going to be out there voting, even in California, where everyone knows it's a, blah, blah. She's going to win. Doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I guess I just wanted to be able to say, like, I did not vote for that guy. But don't you think that it was a little bit different, at least maybe the first time around for Obama? I mean, I think people were legitimate. He made people excited to vote for him. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think that there was a lot of symbology related to that rather than, because I mean, like name a policy that he promoted during his campaign that you were really excited about.
Well, that was so long ago, Shaun.
Well, the whole thing was hope and change, right?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. And
those aren't policies, those are concepts. And that's fine. Like that's fine. Like I think that you can get excited voting for those things, but again, like that's way more packaging than it is anything else. And packaging is what the whole liberal conservative, as derogatory terms comes down to as well. So it's still marketing that got you excited to vote for somebody. I think like your overall point, I think is correct. That you're going to sometimes have these candidates who you actually are excited to vote for. And, it's probably true that that's why Kerry lost, right, to Bush.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well.
Because there was just nothing. There was nothing to excite people to vote for him. And there really wasn't anything. When I spoke to Republicans during that era, it's not like anyone was really excited to vote their side either. So it's, sometimes you get two uninspiring candidates. But generally, yeah, especially in the local elections where fewer people vote, it does often tend to become a lot more about voting against somebody. And I think, all the polls at the time of the election say that nobody was excited to vote for Trump. Like Republicans are slowly kind of, trying to revise history and say we always wanted to vote for him and we're proud of what he's doing and whatever. But that just kind of shows you the power of like party alignment, not so much the power of whatever his philosophies are, because he has none really, right? Like,
right.
He just it's very easy to become very popular in this country by taking a shit on populations that are not the majority.
Did he ever?
And they've been,
yeah,
they've been doing it forever, but like he's just so much more open about it, and people don't care. And that's very distressing. It's like you would think that like
I don't know why.
I remember.
I don't understand
Okay.
why people were so angry at the end of Obama's term. I mean, he tried to do something great. And
There was a black president. Like that really upset a lot of people. Like the fact that a black person got to like that high of a position of power.
And
That's it. Like that's as
people
simple
are
as that
angry
sounds.
about that. It's just, what the fuck is wrong with you?
So one of the things is that like, so you had Fox News out there saying like Obama did this and that, and a lot of it wasn't true, but some of that stuff was easier to believe that a black guy did that than a white guy did it. You know what I mean? Like, so it's preying on the pre-existing notions that people have about people of certain races. And that's one of the reasons why, if you really focus on doing something about racism in this country, it actually helps everybody, including white people, because then we don't have presidents like the one we have now. But there's still this urge to like not do anything about it, that's even more mind-boggling to me, actually. The fact that we have this administration and that people are still really pushing back on the idea that race is actually a very important thing to try to tackle for this country.
Well, it's hard. I think maybe one of the biggest things I've learned, maybe in my last 4 some years as a SJW, and, fighting sometimes with just sort of random public people, but a lot of times, sad to say, with family, it's almost impossible to change anyone's mind, no matter what facts you present them with. They'll always find a way to talk themselves out of it being a fact. I mean, it's like if you say like I'm a liberal or they say, well, you're just a liberal, like they stop reading as soon as they find a point where they can go like, well, that person believes the opposite of me, so I'm just going to stop reading. I'm just going to stop listening, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And when it comes to race in this country, it's I guess it's just really, I think it's just really hard for people to accept that maybe something that they believe, or maybe just sort of indirectly, that racism still exists. That's hard to accept. And
it is hard to accept because we're in a very open, California is a very multicultural place. And I think it's a lot less racism than Midwest and Kentucky, or
there are pockets.
I don't know, Alabama.
It's racism of a different tone, I would say. Like the experiences that I've had in different places, especially ones that consider themselves liberal, like the racism is just as much there. It's just different.
Well, more like what we saw in Get Out, which we talked about when we reviewed that film, which was, these are, if you set aside the horror aspect, if you set aside that part of the movie where they're horrible, horrible people. Socially speaking, in the community and the voting and the larger world, these are all, or pretty much all, people that consider themselves very liberally minded and definitely not racist. And this, what you and I talked about, Babe, was that the racism exists, but in just a different way. It's not, we want to take the black people and,
beat them down,
light them on fire, spray them with fire hoses, keep them away from our daughters, which was that's been a big thing at times in our country's history.
Yes.
But we'll welcome them in, but there's still a different aspect to it.
They're using them.
Yeah. I mean, black people maybe make a great tool because they're so fit and strong.
Now, had it been a white person that of a certain, background of like Scandinavia or something that had all of those things, they would have chosen them. So is that racism?
Well, they didn't.
I know, because they found that the African American person has the optimal bodies.
So they think.
I don't know.
They were picking very specific
I don't know if that was true or if it, who knows, but is it racism at that point?
I don't know, Shaun. Is it racism? Like if it was Get Out, they were only targeting like
Scandinavians,
blonde-haired, blue-eyed, muscular Scandinavians.
Well, then it's just like Hitler.
We're getting into this kind of weird like meta rewriting, but like the point of the fact that they were fetishizing black bodies is, it's so integral to that idea that I don't think you can do that thought experiment. And what I mean is that like historically that stuff is true, whereas the stuff with Scandinavian people is not true. Like when you think about medical experiments, when you think about like the Tuskegee experiment, where they intentionally gave black people syphilis in order to study the effects of syphilis on the human body. When you think about, I forget what the actual operations are called, but there are a lot of kind of OBGYN type, things, surgeries and techniques and whatever that they initially tested on black women without using anesthesia, right? So
right, that stuff is bullshit.
Well, that all goes to a myth that black people don't feel pain like we do, like we whiteys do,
and have lower intelligence and higher thresholds for pain and all that stuff. So that
part of that's we're just calling ourselves pussies, but it's also horrible.
Well, what it is, I mean, if you look at every generalization, every lie about black people specifically, because we're talking about anti-blackness kind of more specifically rather than racism overall.
Yeah, sure.
But all the lies that are associated with anti-blackness specifically have to do with justifying ex post facto the treatment of them in this country, right? So, like for instance, when African slavery was taking off in the United States, they still had white indentured servants. And they would live in the same quarters as black people, but white people started becoming very uncomfortable with the idea of these slaves, which, there is a slight difference between that and indentured servitude. In some cases, it's not worth it to make that distinction, but in this case, it is. They felt so bad about the slavery of African people that they started making up these myths about how less human they were. And that's when you started having slave quarters that were, black only or white only to keep them separate because they might corrupt your white indentured servants. So starting at the very beginning, you have these myths that are created in order to justify the actions that people are taking against black people.
Yeah.
And that's really, that's the foundation of the black American existence, really. So again, like going back to Get Out and going back to the medical stuff, like that movie, part of what it's doing is it's calling back to the fact that, just like in Nazi Germany, where Jewish people and disabled people were dehumanized to the point where you could do human experimentation on them because it didn't register to people as human experimentation, right? It registered as these are people, or these are not people. We could just do all these experiments and it's fine. Mm-hmm. We did the same thing here. And to a large degree, actually, I don't know if y'all know this, but like Hitler's whole like Nazi experiment, like he kind of based all that on the American genocide of Native Americans, right? He was like, he basically looked at America and was like, I like what y'all did with that genocide. Like, let me try that out.
America.
And,
woo!
Yeah. So, I mean, anyway, so basically, I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, if you replace, the black person for a Scandinavian in that situation, then I don't know if you call that racism or whatever else you call it, but point being that like history doesn't support Scandinavians being experimented upon like it does with black people in America.
Naturally. Yeah. It certainly wouldn't make for as compelling of a movie.
Yeah, it wouldn't. I mean,
it might be good.
You wouldn't have a lot of because I mean, this isn't a horror film just kind of based on scares. It's a horror film based on history, right? That's why you have the one. So I'm Asian American, and that's one thing that's interesting about that movie is that you have the one. I think he's Japanese American guy.
Yes. He joined in,
and he's on the side of the white people who are auctioning. Or who are trying to win black bodies on auction. And, that speaks to history. There's a very intentional creation of this model minority myth for Asian Americans that, you can succeed if you play the game, basically, which in a lot of cases in this country's history has not been true. Starting with internment, or not starting, but including internment camps, including a lot of anti-Chinese, anti-immigrant legislation back in the late 1800s. There's just a long history with all this stuff. So Get Out to me is interesting because it includes or makes reference to a lot of this kind of very historical, built-in kind of context about the country. And it's helpful to look at it in that sense to kind of get an idea of why it's so difficult to divorce race from a lot of the issues that we're kind of trying to grapple with now.
Let me just say something here, Shaun, about you.
Sure.
First of all, I'm sorry, you're Asian? No, I'm kidding. No, but from following you on Twitter, and I do not get on Twitter every day, and I miss a lot. But just from what I have read of yours going, through the tweet timeline, that actually made a significant difference when I saw Get Out, because I saw that guy, whatever nationality he was exactly. I think he was Japanese, but I saw that guy being part of that crowd and being part of the bidding and part of this weird version of slavery. And I clued into that as being it had to have been written in there intentionally for this exact stuff, the model minority of just trying to fit in and just being part of that. But then, of course, taken to an extreme degree. And I don't know if I would have gotten anything out of that exactly. It just would have been weird had it not been for reading your Twitter feed. So thank you for that, because I just feel more informed.
Well, thank you. Thank you for actually reading and being informed.
It's so hard for me to identify with people that could hate a race or a color of person or, anybody or a whole group of people, because I always think we're all a little bit of everything. So I don't understand how people we all came from the same place. We know this from history.
If you actually learn history, sure. Not everybody has that luxury.
I just don't I can't identify with it at all. It makes me so confused, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, if you think about the labels of, liberal and conservative, and how there is this way in which even liberals have issues with conservatives. Just when you find out that they're conservative, you look at them differently. You maybe look down on them a little bit more. That's a little bit what it's like. But if it's racially based, the thing is it's that it's just a lot more visible, and it's also hating people of a darker skin color is just a lot more fundamentally sewn into the fabric of this country as kind of a visceral, violent thing. Whereas, political differences like liberal versus conservative, it doesn't tie directly to violence. You didn't have the KKK or liberals.
It's getting there, Shaun. It's getting there. But
no, I mean, I would argue that it's kind of the other way around. Like, if you're racist enough, you're just going to be a conservative because they cater more to your worldview.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've heard it said, not all conservatives are racist, but if you're racist, who are you voting for? I think we probably know.
Yeah.
But if I were to say like, oh God, I hate all Republicans, which is not true. But if I were to say that, I'm saying that because of things that they as a group believe in. If I said, God, I really hate Mexican people, well, that's just stupid. I don't know anything about the Mexican people. If I go into a room full of Republicans, I know something about them. Right?
Well, that's the thing is that people have been convinced that you can know things based on race. I had an episode on basically anti-blackness in the kind of the medical system. Yep. And one of the really interesting concepts that we talked about, my guest was Dorothy Charles, who is amazing. She's a black med student. But one of the things that she talked about that was really great was there's this kind of well-known thing about how, quote unquote, black people are more likely to have things like heart disease or die of heart disease and have diabetes and all this kind of stuff. And that's an interesting thing because that's, it's very medical and scientific sounding. It doesn't sound racist at all, but it is racist in the sense that there's nothing genetically that predisposes black people to those diseases, right? Like they don't look at it and say it's not like they have more genes that are like likely to cause diabetes or that kind of thing. It's more so that the conditions for black people in this country and in the history of, Africans in this country have kind of led to these being, actually I misspoke. They're like, it's sort of on a genetic level, but kind of on this ethnographic level, well, isn't it also like a socioeconomic level too? Because people that wind up at least with type 2 diabetes, which is usually what you're going to see,
they're eating Cheetos and drinking Coke,
and they can't afford good
Shasta.
food. Or
right. No, exactly. And you get, you look at things like food deserts, right? Where are these regions in our country that don't literally don't have access to healthy food, because they're in the middle of all these convenience stores and they don't have a good Whole Foods or whatever. Those food deserts are usually around the most impoverished communities, and the most impoverished communities are usually populated by black and brown people. So you get all these other factors, and they aren't looked at in kind of a holistic way. They look at them and say, well, black people are more likely to die of this and that, and without, like you're saying, without looking at these other reasons that's the case.
Do they have money for fresh vegetables?
Yeah. So in that sense, the very foundation of those medical ideas is racist, right? Because it's assuming that it has to do with race rather than anything else. It's assuming that all black people have this specific thing. And it also allows people to continue blaming black people kind of for their own quote unquote, their own issues. Black people should just eat better and then maybe they would die less, right? When in fact, all of these socioeconomic and socio-medical drivers affect all of that stuff.
Does it make a difference? Does it help or does it not make a difference at all that we live in the information age now because I'm sure this is an argument somewhere along the line. Maybe 50 years ago, a black boy growing up in an all black neighborhood that was, impoverished would never know that you just need to eat some apples or something. But now that there's, the sum total of human knowledge can fit in your pocket.
You should know.
No, I don't think it was ever a knowledge situation. I think it's always been way more of a socioeconomic situation. Right. And the other thing too, is that it's not like people in other neighborhoods eat badly as well, but
I had Taco Bell for breakfast.
Oh, that sounds great, actually. No, but you look at, there's an obesity epidemic, right? That they keep saying that our kids are fat and all this stuff. But, and sorry, this doesn't get exactly to your point, but this does get to kind of the racism that's kind of inherent and systemic in medical communities. We have an obesity epidemic, but we're still not saying that white kids are very likely to be obese or have diabetes. You know what I mean? No one's saying that. They're saying American kids have an obesity issue. So even this idea of pointing it out by race is something that tends to be very specific to darker skinned people. I say darker skinned people because we're including at this point, Black people, Hispanic people, that kind of thing, or Latinx people, I should say.
Well, again, it's hard for me to see that because I come from a place that does a very good job of including everybody. So,
well, but in what sense though?
Where's that?
Schools, like my kids' schools. So these are things probably you don't see, Shaun, because you have no kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I send my kids to school and they come home with, everything that they have is meant to be inclusive of all cultures and generations and races and everything. So there must be places in America, Texas, for instance, that teaches different standards about that sort of thing.
For a fact that Texas does that.
I know for a fact that Texas does that. But I would think that in this day and age, we have this large group of minorities who...
Well, I mean, how do you even define
all
that
different
anymore?
kinds, all different kinds. Like, and then there's a large group of white people and in places like California, and I have to imagine like other places too, I don't know, that they're teaching the same things. So I just don't understand how that word is not like spreading, because I feel like there are more people in California than there are in like Arizona and Oregon and I don't know, Nevada put together that should spread this information. We have, plus the information age.
It's not really about access to information.
It is though, because if you're taught from a young age, like I was in California, taught from a young age that everybody is equal. If you're taught that, then you should say, fuck you, mom and dad. You're stupid and wrong.
Well, no, I mean, if that was the case, then...
That should be the case right now.
Okay,
but how do we get there then?
I feel like we are there. I just feel like we got to squash these little fuckers that are,
No, I mean, I can tell you
Squash the fuckers. That's going to be on our next t-shirt.
Yeah, that sounds like a good slogan. I mean, I was in Portland recently, which is seen as a very liberal city. And actually, like, they have these signs all over the place that say like, oh, you're regardless of your race or religion or whatever, you're welcome here. And like that city is fucking racist as hell. Like
what?
I was so uncomfortable the whole time I was there. And that's the thing is that like, so the way that you're presenting California, like I don't, that's not a California that I identify with. Like I still see and deal with racism on a daily basis in Los Angeles. Like, and I did in San Diego too. I actually was a lot less comfortable in San Diego because that city is so white and kind of weird about it. And San Diego is actually a conservative county. So there is that. But like I said, even here in LA, like I think what we think of as racism has the potential to be very different from each other, right? Like, I didn't see the KKK marching in Portland, but I also... like there were some weird situations where like, well, first of all, like they did not let me forget that I was a different race while I was there. Like the way that people look at you and the way that people interact with you, it's not so much like I hate you because you're Asian. It's more like you need to understand how much I'm willing to accept you, even though you're Asian. And that sounds... Well,
is it that kind of get out liberal racism? Is that what you're meaning?
Wait a second. How do you know what somebody else is thinking? Did they say something to you? You don't know.
Well, okay.
Maybe they just didn't like what you were wearing, or maybe they didn't like the way you did your hair.
If that's where you set the bar for microaggressions, then then hardly anything is ever racist. But I think what racial minorities are saying in this country right now is that when we see stuff that manifests that way, it's never disconnected from the larger shit that happens, right? It's never like there are so many stories. If you kind of hang around people of color enough, like you get so many stories where it's like, yeah, I thought this person was racist and it's hard to put my finger on it. And they were doing this and that and whatever. They weren't wearing a hood and like burning crosses in anyone's yard. But it just feels off. And then 3 months later, like that person has done something very specifically that even white people would call racist. Right. So, like, there's no way. This is where a lot of the communication breaks down because there's an unwillingness to use the same, I guess, metrics on this stuff. Like I can tell you about the white guy who tried to spit on a black guy right in front of me when I was in Portland. And that's like, I think that's a very direct kind of racist thing. I can tell you about the woman. I was at a restaurant with 2 white women, and the waitress over and over like refilled their drinks, but never refilled mine until one of the white women asked them to refill my drink specifically. And like maybe that's less like clear as kind of a racist thing. And then I can tell you about like just the looks that people were giving me, which I can never, ever, ever prove as kind of racially motivated. But
right. Well, you can't because things happen and people have bad days and they forget to fill people's drinks.
Right, but I'm not stupid. I know that.
That happens to me.
No,
that happens to everybody.
I've known that for my entire life. Like you do get this sense when you're dealing with it for your entire life that you can tell the difference sometimes. And I'm not saying that like everybody who looks at me a certain way, I think that they're racist. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying there are circumstances in which like I recognize the looks that I've gotten before in other people's faces and can kind of understand it. I mean, like, so I live in Koreatown in Los Angeles, and there's there are a lot of Korean people here. I'm not Korean. I am Japanese and Chinese. And a lot of people that are Korean that are the generation above me do not like, especially Japanese people, because of the history between those two countries. And like, sometimes it's really uncomfortable. Like sometimes they are being like, sometimes older Korean people in this community like are acting a certain way towards me because of that. Like I know for sure, like they're more mean. They're more like short with me. And like, I accept that. Like there's a certain level of that in Hawaii where I grew up as well, like a little bit of tension between Asian communities. But again, like that's the kind of thing you could never really pinpoint as quote unquote racism, depending on where your bar exists for that stuff. So I don't know. I mean, like the question becomes, I guess, like, for instance, at the restaurant, I don't know. I mean, there's no way you could ever say, because if I ask the waitress, like, are you racist? And is that why you're not refilling my drink, my water and my coffee? Like, she's not going to say yes. Like, yeah, that's exactly why.
Probably not.
So well, when a woman relies upon tips for her, you know, I just don't, and you're with another group of people. You're with the whole group of people.
That's what makes it kind of weird and suspect, right?
That's what makes it suspect, but she's not going to get a tip for that shit.
Well, right. I mean, I tip based off of how often I get my drink refilled.
No, but if they refuse to fill somebody's drink, you're not going to tip them. Now, when I was in junior high, I was the minority, and all of the people hated me. So is that racism? Is it I was white?
And you got picked on for being white?
I got picked on specifically by groups of people because I was different. Is that racism? I don't know.
I don't know either. But I want to try to I want to go back to something you said earlier, babe. And first of all, so Shaun, when it comes to things like going to Portland, we've never been. We don't get out much. Really, I mean, we go out, but it's usually just the two of us. We're
simple people.
You know, we have kids. So like if we get out, we're taking our kids places, we're keeping our eyes on them. And so we're probably not noticing a lot about the world around us. But what we do see, and I think this is what Jennifer was trying to get to, is like, whether it's the curriculum or just the way that kids interact in schools these days, or the amount of diversity in our California classrooms, it seems like, and I'm hoping, but it seems like we're maybe just 1 or 2 generations away from just kind of forgetting about all this stuff and just liking each other or hating each other based off of what we act like instead of what we look like. And that could go anything from, disabilities to skin color to religion and all these things that have just fueled so much hate over the years. It seems like our kids just aren't exposed to that. And I think they'll learn history. Don't get me wrong. I think.
And they're learning the real history this time, not the shit they taught us in school.
Right. Well, our boys are in 4th grade, and I think it was 4th grade, maybe 5th, but my daughter started learning about, the civil rights movement and stuff, and that was great. And I think she was learning, quality stuff, not the Texas textbooks.
Yeah.
So they'll still learn the history, but it seems like it just doesn't make any sense to them. Even when like California was trying to get rid of gay marriage and sort of did for a while.
Right. They're like, why can't they marry whoever they want?
Right. Yeah. My daughter was pretty young and she wanted to know what people were protesting on the street about with these signs. And I said, well, if a man is in love with a woman and wants to get married, that makes sense, right? Okay, well, what if it's a man that falls in love with a man or a woman that falls in love with a woman? And she was like, well, I don't know, that's kind of strange or something. She was very young and didn't get it, but she also was like, well, then they can marry each other. Who cares? She was too young to say who gives a shit, but that's what it basically came down to. Was it just doesn't make any sense to them. And I hope it stays that way. I hope that doesn't change when they grow up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like that's all of that is such a huge kind of thing to unpack. I think one of the things, especially when you look at towards the end of the civil rights movement, you look at Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Like, you start getting to this point where, yes, people do recognize that other people should have rights, but that doesn't necessarily keep them from feeling that other people are inferior in some way, that you need to be paternalistic over them, that you need to whatever. And that's kind of this weird gray area that we're kind of or that I'm definitely operating in now, where it's like, for me, it's not enough for people not to be racist. Like, they kind of have to be extremely anti-racist, right? Because we have this system and this way of thought in this country that kind of that really protects the racism, the anti-blackness specifically, and the anti-Native American stuff that the country is really built on. Like, if you look at stuff like Colin Kaepernick kneeling, like the really convenient thing, and this is straight out of the playbook. Like, you could totally predict all of this stuff happening. Like, first, the kneeling is called out as disrespectful. Then it's redefined as being about the flag or the anthem somehow, or about the military somehow, which has nothing to do with. Then it gets co-opted in the name of this like vague sense of unity, which kind of whitewashes the whole idea of the protests themselves. Like, it takes the words police brutality out of the equation. And so now the protest is kind of rendered meaningless, because now nobody kind of really has a good idea of like what it was about in the first place. So like, there's nothing, I think there's nothing there that you can really point to and say like, well, that shit's racist. Like, but at the same time, they still manage to kind of squash a very black centric kind of form of protest. Does that make sense? Like, I'm just kind of trying to present an analogy that explains why defining racism as this extremely narrow thing that you can prove, legally or prove to the satisfaction of the person you're talking to, like, doesn't get us necessarily to the place where we're trying to get.
Well, I think the kneeling thing has turned from a Black Lives Matter silent protest into more of a freedom of speech issue, which unfortunately gets away from the original point, but it's not a terrible thing to have as a discussion topic anyway, because it all started with the notion that this motherfucker better shut up, and he wasn't even saying anything. He was just kneeling. And like, that was too much.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, okay, wait, like, I'm just going to gently push back a little bit, because like saying that it's not necessarily a bad thing that we're talking about free speech. Yeah. But like, that's kind of the thing, is that if we let that happen enough, and we've let it happen enough in this country's history, where we've said, okay, this is a protest specifically acknowledging that black people are treated more badly in this country than other people. But then as people who consider themselves progressive saying, yeah, but it's okay if the focus got moved to this
well,
other.
I'm not saying it's okay. I'm not saying it's okay.
No, I know, but that just kind of that framing and saying like this is also an important thing. Like that's kind of what I mean about being like very, I guess, deliberately anti-racist versus just not being racist, right? Where like it sounds radical to say no, like. We need to keep the focus on this one thing. All this other stuff is garbage. Like all this other stuff is really, it might be well-meaning, but it's complete garbage. Like we need to keep it specifically on this one topic. That sounds very radical when you pose it, or when I've posed it to people who consider themselves liberal. But does that make sense? That's kind of this one of the distinctions I see between being anti-racist and not racist.
I think you're right. I guess the way I think about these kind of issues is that, God, I mean, humanity, we can all be such fucking assholes. And it's really, it's so hard to get people to turn around their way of thinking that it might, maybe this is it. I mean, it's the Black Lives Matter is very important. And I think it's great that Colin took a stand. Now, the people that most need to hear his message or see his message or whatever are like, hey, this guy's kneeling during the national anthem. I guess I feel like it's sort of maybe if we can get through the free speech part of the argument that he should be allowed to protest in the first place without people calling him all sorts of horrible things. Maybe if we can get through that part of it, then we can get back to the original part of it and actually have a chance of people hearing it instead of only seeing someone kneeling and getting all pissed off and not caring what the message was.
That's the thing. Like that's okay. So this is where historical context comes in handy because because I agree with that like in a way, but the place where I'm
idealistic, I know, but
no, it's not idealism. That is how anti-racist movements in the past have often been dealt with and swept under the rug, is to say, okay, we get it, but there's a larger issue at play. So let's kind of like, we'll deal with this larger issue first, then we'll get back to you. And
all right,
no one ever gets back to it. Like that's kind of the thing. Like that's why like people who share these Martin Luther King quotes about like peace and nonviolence and love and seeing everybody as all the same. Like that's like a quarter of his actual kind of teachings and ideas, right? The other 3/4 are actually a lot more radical and a lot more kind of pushing towards change rather than just making these philosophical points about race being a thing that we shouldn't use to divide people. It's kind of the same thing where people were like, well, let's just get everybody to see that like race shouldn't be an issue and then we'll deal with the other stuff later. And what that's manifested into nowadays is people saying, for instance, yeah, we should be colorblind about race. We shouldn't, like, everybody's all the same. We shouldn't ever kind of divide people by race. But that actually causes a harm in the here and now because of people doing things like all lives matter, right? They think that like taking race out of some kind of stance means that it's more kind of morally intellectual, morally superior. So again, like we didn't get to the actual point that Dr. King was trying to make. We decided we wanted to do a United Colors of Benetton kind of thing and like wipe that whole thing away, but it ended up creating this like more tangled idea of how race and racism actually work in this country, right? Like, so like you said, we lean towards this idealistic notion of it that kind of presupposes that racism is less entrenched than it actually is, if that makes sense. So, but this is all like, I think reasonable people can disagree on a lot of this stuff, but like, this is all kind of like very deep critical race theory where people like, where you have to be looking not only at kind of behavioral aspects of it, because I think that's mostly what the three of us are focusing on is behavioral aspects. If people are taught this, they'll believe this. If they want to change this thing, they'll change this thing. For critical race theory, like a lot of this stuff, you have to also have the history book open at the same time as the behavioral science book, right? Because there are situations in which all these things that sound reasonable are kind of like twisted in order to get us away from kind of thinking about the things that might actually make a difference, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense. It's
very deep. There's a lot going on.
Well, I mean, one thing for me, like I'm a real silver linings kind of guy, and when I look at, I mean, just it was last week or whatever with Trump tweeting about friggin' NFL kneeling protests and all that. There's still something to it that's helping keep the conversation going. It's not the same conversation. I don't even know what to make of friggin' Trump. I mean, the noise machine is so blaring and confusing and overwhelming.
That's only because he's trying to keep your eye on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's intentional. He wants to tweet for 20 minutes and have us all talking about kneeling.
In the background, he's passing some shitty ass laws.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the background, he's proposing a tax plan that's, you know, gonna save him billions of dollars, you know, over his lifetime and death time. Maybe I think a lot of that is what's making it hard for us to focus, and I don't know how we combat that. Is that I can look and be like, well, at least we're still talking about free speech, guys, and you
don't look at his Twitter.
You don't have to look at his Twitter because you can go on if you're on any social media, the radio. I mean, it's still
news reports everywhere. On every single thing he tweets.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. No, I mean there is a lot going on. I think that's why one of the urges is certainly to try to deal with everything. But like for instance, like on Twitter, I'm not really talking about Trump's whole thing with North Korea because I have Twitter friends who parse it a lot better than I do. Like some of them were actually born in South Korea, so they have a little bit, you know, better of an idea. And so I'll kind of just retweet them and read their stuff. I think it is important to a large degree for people to try to take on what they can, but not to think that being quote unquote good in the age of Trump means that you have to take on everything, you know?
We tried for a couple weeks. It's impossible.
No, it is. It really, I mean, and that's why I'm in a very specific area about race. And if you asked me questions about like, what's happening kind of in the realm of like gender inequality right now under Trump, like I couldn't really have a lot of good input about it because I'm doing deep work on specific things rather than shallow work on a lot of different things, you know? And I think that's okay. I think people need to to be okay with themselves for approaching it that way. It's a lot. And even if Trump weren't in power, like it's a lot, like all of this stuff that's why, you know, you have like specific like degrees and areas of study that just deal with this one thing, you know? So yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's all complicated. It all is very like frustratingly complicated.
Well, a lot of what you've often spoken up about, and I think you've written. Well, I don't think I know you've written stuff outside of the Twitterverse too. Like you've gotten into some other article writing here and there. More than 140 characters at a time. But you've talked a lot about, you started with No Totally. I mean, you're clearly a movie buff. And if anyone has listened to your show where you talk about the movie episodes, like you come as more than a fanboy. You definitely have, you take an intellectual tone about it and you seem to really know your stuff. So like you got involved a lot with debates about whitewashing and we've talked about you on our show a few times when we talked about shit like Iron Fist. Which was a hot topic for a while, and then it came back around again recently. It's an interesting topic to so Iron Fist. Let's address that because I did not grow up a comic book fan. I'm not a comic book reader really at all. I'm a gamer So like my most exposure to superheroes was this DC Heroes role-playing game that I used to play for a while in my high school days.
Sweet.
And it was pretty cool. And I would just read the books and just learn all the backstories of all the characters. And I was almost encyclopedic for a while. They've left me behind, these heroes. But when it came then to seeing them on the screen, whether it's TV or movies or whatever, it always seemed like it was really important to have the characters represented as they are in the comic books. Like, to me, that would make a lot of sense. Is that, if Batman is a muscular white rich guy in the comics, then I would assume he's going to be a muscular white rich guy in the movies. And hell, that made Michael Keaton hard to swallow. And I'm not the only one, even though he did fine. He did great, actually. Yeah. So then when you see an uproar about Iron Fist, I find myself swimming in the two different pools of like, well, on one hand, it would be great to have some more diversity in our superhero universe. And now I'm a grown up, so it's easier for me to wrap my head around that. But then on the other hand, Iron Fist has been a white dude in the comics all these years. So it kind of makes sense that they would cast him as he was in the comic books. Like I guess don't consider that to be a villainous move on the part of the Marvel TV folks. I mean, they're just doing what they see on the page. But that all said, like if in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Tony Stark retires or dies, which I think he might do. I think one of the two is coming up really soon. Then the next Iron Man should probably be a teenage black girl, because that's what it is in the comic books, and I'm all for that.
That would be awesome.
Right? It sounds awesome. I don't know her backstory. I don't know how she gets an Iron Man suit, but whatever it is, I'm in. Let's do it. Make Thor a woman. That's cool too. So like, let's have that diversity. But since it's coming from I guess the comics come first, let's get the diversity into the comics and then we'll get it into the movies. And I don't know, like that's where my white brain goes. But can you tell us the other perspective of some of that controversy? Like for instance, Iron Fist, I think would be a great example that rallied a lot of people.
Yeah. Iron Fist is a good example. I think, so there are a couple of false equivalencies made there, like as far as race just being kind of an appearance thing, like being muscular or not, because there, I'm going to sound like a broken record on some of this stuff, but like there isn't necessarily a history of kind of systemic oppression or invisibility or violence against people for being muscular, for instance, right? But there is that history for against people of certain races. So one of the things that I think is important to note is that, like, for instance, Batman being white is not kind of a racial statement in the way that Iron Fist being white is, because of the backstory of the character. So the Iron Fist it's a title conferred upon people who are some kinds of defenders of some kind of made up Asian mystical
magical realm. Yes.
Yeah. And so you have a couple issues there. One is that white people do have a tendency to kind of make themselves the master of other cultures, and that can be demeaning. So it's called the white savior trope, is that or the mighty whitey is something that people call it. I'm not really a huge fan of that term, but
it just doesn't sound like something I'd ever say.
Sounds like underwear.
Yeah, it does. That's the first thing that came into my mind. It was like, I used to wear mighty whiteys, and now I went boxer briefs.
Exactly. So it's part of, it's again, historically, it's kind of a part of this wave, this trend of seeing Asian American stuff, seeing martial arts specifically as this thing that you can kind of co-opt but make popular, but only if you have a white character. So the whole idea that you can't have an Asian person representing this culture that is Asian in origin is a little racist, right? I mean, it's a little like, it's the excuse that's always given, and actually is still given nowadays, is that people won't care about the Asian character. Like if you make the character Asian, they won't care. You have to make the character white in order for them to care.
Can't it be just that the original writer wrote it for white American kids so that they could
he's
identify with this white boy?
Identify
sure.
With, okay.
Why can't we just see it as that? Because that's the way I see it. That's what actually happened.
That's kind of problematic in itself, I guess. Like, why? What kids are we raising that can only identify with white kids? Because
the white children were the majority of the people that were looking at the comics.
Well, I don't know how far Iron Fist goes back. There's probably, if you were taking comic demographic audiences, or whether people cared about the demographics of the audiences of comic books back, I mean, even if it was just the 80s or the 70s, I don't know.
It's a way for that child to feel like he could be a superhero. Now, I see what you're saying. Why couldn't they have seen him as an Asian child or a black child or... Well,
Shaun, you used to... Spider-Man was your favorite guy, right, when you were growing up?
Yeah.
And you wanted to be Spider-Man. But, so from the perspective of a young Asian boy growing up and idolizing Spider-Man, did that affect you in terms of relatability, or would it have made a difference if there was an Asian superhero that was maybe not Spider-Man but every bit as cool as Spider-Man, that was like at the top of the Marvel charts?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think my thinking about this kind of evolves all the time, but like I do think that it would have made somewhat of a difference. Like I never kind of sat down and consciously thought like, oh, I can't be Spider-Man because I'm Asian and he's white. It was more so that I was always like, there's something about me that makes me not a hero.
You felt that way?
Yeah, for sure.
Now, my son, his favorite is Spider-Man, and he is super excited about Miles Morales. Is that his name?
Yes.
About Miles Morales, Spider-Man. He's like super stoked and he can't wait.
But he's already had a white Spider-Man for decades. Like that's already existed. Like,
no, he loves Black Panther. He loves all.
No, I'm not talking about what he loves.
What I'm saying is
you can have, if you have a lot of representation, like there's nothing that tells white kids that they can't be something in Marvel comics. There's a ton of shit that tells Asian kids they can't be something in both Marvel comics, TV and film.
I feel
if you already have that representation, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, Miles Morales is great. Like if you already have, if 99% of the other heroes are already representing you, then it's natural that you wouldn't be upset or you would be excited about something different. But like when you don't have that, you're coming from a very different perspective.
But there's all kinds of, especially in Marvel, there's all kinds of heroes that are different.
Well,
I mean, that's true, but I don't think
I thought that's what you were saying, that if you're always represented, then you wouldn't be upset. Well, but there's all kinds of colors of heroes and different races.
Talk to me about the Asian heroes in Marvel.
Well, I'm talking about in Iron Fist, there are many heroes.
Well, in Iron Fist, you have Colleen Wing. She's awesome. She's not the title character, and she's fucking, Lord knows, she's way more likable than Iron Fist probably will ever be. I guess that's good. Let me ask you this, Shaun, because this is something that hit that I don't want to get too far off. I don't know. I mean, the thing with kids, I'm not sure how to think about that. I mean, I think there is a point where it's easier maybe for someone like your son to be really excited about a couple heroes that are not white, they're people of color, but we don't know. I guess we don't know from our perspective what would be different if we weren't white. I guess I want to take Shaun's word for that on a lot of stuff. But let me ask you this about Iron Fist. Iron Fist, I think it certainly generated a lot of controversy as to whether or not they should have recast Danny Rand as being. He could have been a rich kid from New York that's also Asian, that also crashed and learned martial arts and became a superstar. Like, there's nothing unbelievable about that.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing white specific about his story, for sure.
Right. Definitely not. But I think Iron Fist was reviled far outside of the whitewashing. Is there anything about that becomes bittersweet where you're like, well, at least it sucked and everyone thought it was very badly acted?
I guess. I mean, like, just on a personal level, but like as far as like affecting change, not really. I mean, it's already been, he's already appeared in a different series, The Defenders, and then they're already filming the second season.
Still wasn't good.
Well, and the thing, like, I think the discussion around it was more frustrating to me because, there was a lot of this whole idea of like, well, if you make him Asian, it doesn't make sense because he is supposed to be this symbol of white privilege. So you social justice warriors, like you're defeating your own purposes by saying that he should be Asian.
Wait a second. Wait, that's interesting. I don't think I heard that argument. So
yeah, well, okay. I mean, we can't. There's no way we can cover that in this episode. Like because that. Well, hold on. Like, have you ever heard like when you think of white privilege, are you kind of aware of the fact that white privilege doesn't just extend to white people? Like it's not a specifically
no, I'm
white
not
person
aware
thing.
of that.
Well,
yeah.
Okay.
So that whole concept is very difficult, and I don't like. It would take 3
Are you
hours
talking
to
about
explain.
just privileged?
Well, that's not what I thought you meant anyway. I thought it was like, the point of Danny Rand is that even though he's white and grew up with white privilege, he's now having to be a dirty, homeless vagabond kind of guy.
Yeah,
and he's
that's
not,
part of it. Is
like
that
he's lost some of his privilege, and he also is having to learn that there's more important things in the world than his whiteness and his richness and the way he grew up, which was nothing but privilege.
Right. Yeah. The argument is that you can't transpose that onto an Asian American simply because of the skin color, and that's not strictly correct.
Yeah,
that's not strictly correct because, like, I mean, this is something that we deal with kind of within the Asian American community all the time. Is that we actually do have a certain amount of what you would call white privilege. We call it, to be more specific, we kind of call it white proximity, but white proximity is kind of just another way of saying like you have a certain amount of white privilege even though you're not white.
I feel a lot of hatred towards white right now. I don't consider myself white. I consider myself kind of tannish or olive skinned, but I feel so much anger towards it that it makes me ashamed to be a white or considered being white. And I shouldn't be, because I'm not in that population.
Well, I mean, like,
I'm not in the population that you are saying is racist or against all of this. You know what I mean? I just want to live my life in peace. Really.
That's kind of one of the things that's interesting is like, I'm not like, no one's calling you racist, but like the thing about privilege, and like I said, Asian Americans, like we have a certain amount of this privilege. Like you can't, it's not like it goes away once you say you don't want it. You know what I mean? And so like a lot of these conversations end up being about people who don't feel as if they like should be lumped into them, Well,
but why should they? If they're just going about their life and they have friends of all different and they support the right thing and they say, yes, I don't agree with that, and they vote against whatever it is that we need to vote against. I mean, that's what we need everybody to do. Lead the good example.
Well, that goes back into the idea of, is being not racist enough, or do you have to be anti-racist?
But I feel like I am considered a racist by everybody that looks at me. I feel like as you're speaking, I feel a lot of anger towards me because I'm considered that color. I don't feel okay about that.
I'm sorry, babe. I didn't feel like Shaun's angry at us.
I feel like you're angry at me sometimes too, as being a Jewish person. I feel like you're angry at me sometimes also because I'm not that. I feel like everybody is all of the same color. And I feel like the anger that everybody has towards each other is self-perpetuating, and it's not going to stop until people actually say, what the fuck? What are you all doing? All of these skinheads that are out there creating all of this terror and all of the terrorists out there. What the fuck is everybody doing? We're human beings and we're supposed to be smarter than that.
Well, that's okay. That's an interesting question. So like there's the anti-fa. Is it fa or fa? I don't know. Because
What
it's
is
for
that?
fascist, right? The alt left, as now the right wants to put it. But the anti-fascist movement, I think they're at least part of their credo, from maybe what little I know these days. But part of it is that just trying to say the right things isn't necessarily enough anymore, and just trying to, or saying that like even as far as like, you know, nonviolent protests are the only thing that a good liberal should do or something like that. Like that's not enough anymore. Like they're getting more militant about wanting to fight off Nazism, you know, American Nazism, for instance. And I don't really know how I feel about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so like Antifa is something that it like they're one of the I can't remember where they are, but one of the big kind of organizations that's been very prominent, like has been around for over 60 years, and this has always been their philosophy.
I had no idea.
Yeah, see, and that's the thing is it does make a difference when you think about historical context, that like it's not like these are liberal kids who like read a new website yesterday and became this thing. These are philosophies and ways of dealing with fascism that predate Trump, that predate all of this stuff, that exist, you know, between Hitler and us, and have squashed like legitimate fascist movements during that time. You know what I mean? So
well, now it's all coming to the surface, because as the Nazis feel comfortable in coming out of their dark holes, Antifa
when fascists start to rise, then you get the anti-fascists start to rise as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of the discussion revolves around like, oh, should we accept these as a new style of tactics? But they're not new. Like they're coded over generations, and they're known to work in a certain way. So I mean, that's a whole other thing too. Like we can talk about, you know, I've been talking with someone who's very invested in that movement, who talks about the actual history, and why you get this idea that violence is acceptable. Not that it's the first resort, but that it is acceptable at a certain point for defense. Those discussions tend to happen in the context of, well, yesterday we had liberals and now we have these violent anti-fascists, and it's just not the case. And so it becomes really hard to kind of talk about like the philosophies at the center of these things when we're decontextualizing them from all of the history.
Sure. Yeah. Well, but okay. What does it, excuse me, what does it mean to be anti-racist? Let's leave the fascism alone. That's a whole separate problem.
Yeah.
But what does it mean to be anti-racist? Like we've been saying, like in our sort of insular lives where we pretty much go to work and, you know, hang out with our kids, and then sometimes we watch Game of Thrones and podcast about it.
Yeah.
Like we just don't see a lot of that stuff. So what is it? But I mean, we don't consider ourselves to be racist, and I think we do all right, you know, when in a situation where that could be an issue. And I'm always happy to speak out. But what does it mean to be anti-racist instead of just not racist?
Sure. I think learning, listening, and speaking are all kind of like the very general, like dip your toe in aspects to it.
Okay.
So there, one thing that I really started learning in listening to people who have kind of different experiences of oppression is that like there are a lot of things that just don't, like they won't make sense to me logically until I get more information that I'm used to getting. So a lot of times, like you get an argument presented to you and you're like, well, I need, like, you know, say 3 more sentences about that to me because I don't quite understand it. And then you hear the 3 additional sentences and you're like, oh, okay, yeah. Now I can make a judgment on that thing. What I've learned a lot recently, you know, dealing kind of like with other Asian Americans, dealing with Black Americans, dealing with queer people, transgender people, a lot of times these arguments on their face don't make sense, and they still don't make sense after the 3 sentences. And so a lot of times what's required is to kind of understand historical context. And a lot of the time that historical context is kind of intentionally expunged from the way that we teach people history in this country. And it's not that there's this like gigantic conspiracy as far as what we teach people, but there are things that we make more or less acceptable or more or less comfortable to talk about. So this goes kind of back to what we were talking about earlier, where like politics has become more and more uncomfortable to talk about, I think, in this country. Like, we used to be able to kind of have like Democrats and Republicans kind of talking to each other in a way that didn't just evolve into name calling within the first 5 minutes. But it seems like we're not at that point anymore. It seems like we're at the point where it's really easy to just kind of like emulate the talking heads on TV and just kind of start calling each other snowflakes right away. And there's a way in which that like making that the acceptable form of discussion about politics in this country keeps us at this real like shallow surface level. Does that make sense so far?
I think so. Go on.
So when you look at racial discussions in the same way, for me, that's kind of what's happening, is that you have this way that we're used to talking about race that keeps it at this very kind of like surface level. And I think that's kind of what being kind of not racist kind of is. So when you think about being anti-racist, it's about getting past that point. It's about getting to the discussions that are often very uncomfortable, rather than just calling someone a snowflake and then walking away. It's about having the discussions where like you're learning about how you, in a lot of cases, people who are you or who look like you are complicit in a certain amount of these things, and kind of getting past the defensiveness and being able to be like, well, I can see myself as a good person, even if myself or my ancestors like are perpetuating some of this nonsense, or maybe all of it. And that's a really, really like super difficult thing to do. Like, I can tell you, like, early on Twitter, like I was called out pretty frequently by people who are now kind of my friends, but like I would get all these strangers replying like, no, here's where you're not understanding. Here's where you're being racist. And like, it's the hardest thing in the world, I think, for me to be like, well, maybe I should take that into consideration and listen to it. Like, it hurts so much in the moment that it's really hard to kind of step back and understand it for what it is. That's one of the reasons I like Twitter so much for this stuff, by the way, is because I can see those conversations happening, but not be the one who's kind of being talked at. And so it gives me a little bit of distance to be like, oh, okay, now I see why that thing I said last week is pretty wrong or insensitive, whatever. But anyway, this is just kind of a long exposition of what I originally said, which is kind of being willing to listen, being willing to learn, and then being willing to kind of like speak up on basis of that stuff. Typically being not racist is fairly comfortable in this country, and being anti-racist is kind of uncomfortable. So sometimes I use that as my measuring stick. Like, if I feel too comfortable in what I'm saying lately, then maybe I haven't been on the ball enough. You know what I mean?
Well, a little bit. I mean, I lurk more on Twitter than I post. And even when I post, it's with Jennifer's face on it. But I mean, I do think that the listening part has been good. I think, well, I'll say this. I think a lot of times, like if it's maybe a thread that you've started, or maybe you posted a few things and people are chiming in, and it does feel like there's a lot of, I guess kind of a, oh, fuck all white people sentiment, which then, while I want to maybe I would want to chime in and say something to the larger, bigger picture of your original point, but then as I'm reading the thread, I'm like, well, fuck it. I mean, I'm white, so I don't know. Maybe I should just stay out of this. But like, I would like to be part of the conversation, but I just don't know how that, I don't know. I guess it's hard to feel comfortable in that. And
I totally identify with that, because there are so many conversations where I, as an Asian American, am not welcome, right? Or I, as a straight man, am not welcome. So there is this certain level of like conversation that goes on within communities that really isn't for the consumption of outside communities necessarily, or not that it's not for the consumption, but it's not maybe like there isn't a good way of kind of chiming in, right? And that happens all the time. There are a ton of threads and tweets that I look at and I'm like, hey, I can learn from this, but it doesn't necessarily mean I have to kind of jump in and redirect the conversation. Like maybe if I want to do that, I can write my own tweet being like, hey, I saw this thing somewhere and now like, here's my thoughts on it. You know what I mean? Like you then start a different conversation on your own because you're not derailing the initial tweet, right? So there's all this stuff that I think we're not used to doing. We're not used to saying like, oh, I guess I don't belong in this conversation. Like I don't know if it's like an American thing or what, but like we're really taught to believe that like we belong in all of the conversations. And I think especially on Twitter, like you learn very quickly that you don't necessarily, right? Maybe you need to start another conversation that's separate. Because I think if anybody could jump into any conversation on Twitter, like it would just immediately be 100% unusable, right?
Well, sometimes it is. I mean, the nature of Twitter is very public. It's very different from Facebook, where you have to, well, unless someone's posting very poorly and doesn't care about security, you're generally only talking to people that you've already put on a list of saying, these are the people I want to talk to. Whereas Twitter, unless you really go out of your way, is intended to be public, a public conversation, really. So that could be great for inclusivity. And it's probably been great for people finding each other and building new communities. And I mean, look, I don't have to be a part of fucking any community. I've got plenty going on in my world most of the time. But I don't know. I guess well, I mean, Jennifer felt like, like you're angry at some of the things she's saying. And I think that as that anger boils up and you know what it is? It's at least for me, I'm not going to put words in Jennifer's mouth, but for me, it's a feeling of like, I don't want to be grouped in with the white people you're talking about. And I would kind of like you to know that, but I feel like if I try to point that out, then I'm just a stupid white person in a different way. Maybe that's what it is. I guess I just, maybe I probably wouldn't chime in every conversation, or maybe even any, because I'm lazy, but it's just a weird feeling to know that there's this cloud hanging over the country. And maybe before the Twitter age, maybe a lot of us thought we were past that. And now it turns out we're not. And there are a lot of angry people out there, and I think they're generally angry for very good reasons. And you just don't want to be the subject of that anger.
Yeah, I didn't do any of that shit.
Well, yeah,
I said, yeah, I didn't do any of that shit.
I didn't do any of that shit either. But we are unfortunately grouped in with the people that are marching in Charlottesville or whatever.
No, not necessarily. I don't.
Well,
think
in some ways, there are more broad conversations. I've seen it plenty of times. Yeah, it's like, oh, white people again. Right, but I think there's a difference between saying that and saying all white people. And this is a conversation that I get in a lot with so many different people. And that's actually one of the things too, like, especially because my account is the way it is, like I have a certain amount of followers, that I do end up having to have conversations like dozens of times. And sometimes that can be tiring. And sometimes people don't, especially on Twitter, sometimes people don't respect the fact that you don't want to talk about that today, right? Like you want to break from having the same conversation every day. And so that's where I think a lot of like what seems like anger kind of comes from, is that a lot of times you're reading this thing where it's like, I've said this 40 times before, but let me say it again. And so there's a level of frustration sometimes. But also like
this might be kind of a difference between majority and minority populations as well, is that I've never, I see all the time people tweeting stuff like, oh, Asian people this or that, Asian people this or that. And like, I kind of grew up knowing that when I read that, if I don't feel like I'm included in that group, I don't get like emotionally affected by it. Like, I don't consider myself part of that group. So that tweet doesn't apply to me or something. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like most minority populations, like, kind of grow up hearing that all the time. And it comes off as really, like, it's strange to me, or it's not strange, it's alien to me when people say, oh, I feel like I'm being included when you say white people. Because like, that's not how I've ever kind of had to interpret the generalizations of the groups that I'm a part of. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I think there is this weird kind of like schism, I guess, an understanding of what the generics are. Like, if you say all white people do this or that, then yeah, I totally like see the issue there. But saying that white people do something, or say let's say, because I'm straight, right? So straight people do this or that. I don't, again, I don't see that as covering me unless they say all straight people, or unless what they're saying is actually accurate to what I do because of like ignorance or whatever else. I think, yeah, I don't know. I don't have any good advice on how to like kind of emotionally separate oneself from that, but that's just kind of how I think about it.
It's funny, like it's very different if I look at it from not the other side, but there's an other side. And I'm thinking of something that happened once on Facebook, not Twitter, and involving someone I'm related to, but I'm not going to say who. But this person, he or she, shared something from like a conservative Facebook page, and it was a video of a couple of young black guys beating the hell out of some older black guy just because he wouldn't give up his backpack. And then they took his backpack and walked away. And someone filmed this, and one of their friends, I guess, and it wound up on social media. And the person that I was related to shared that and said something, or actually didn't even share it. Sorry, just commented on it, but it showed up in my feed. And the comment was something along the lines of like, well, this is what happens because they something. And like, it was a very broad statement, and it didn't say black people or anything like that. But it did say a they. And I saw that and I was like, whoa, wait, hey, what? Hey, no, I mean, what you're seeing here is a couple of dickheads kicking the shit out of some other dickhead. But I don't know what it actually meant in that person's head. But it came across as being very, I guess, inclusive, for lack of a better word, of black people. Like, I guess they all just like to beat each other up and steal backpacks. Like, that's what it seemed like. And I got into it with that person a little bit about that comment. But I guess from that outside perspective, it seemed very clear, like, you would never say something like that and mean all black people. And let's just make sure we clarify that, because that's a fucked up thing to say. But then when you're on the flip side where it's people, I mean, you're right. I should really look at it more if I see someone, talking about how the stupid white people have fucked up the country again. I should try to take that internally and know that I wasn't the one that did that. And I'm trying hard not to be involved with people that do that sort of thing. So,
right. Yeah.
I guess. I mean, I know you're right.
I think no. Well, I mean, it is like, it's an interesting dynamic because, I mean, people don't talk about Asian Americans quite as much. So that's why I don't get to use myself as an example for a lot of the stuff. But like, if you're growing up black, like, just look at how many times blackness is called out. Like, I've made this point before where you've seen these headlines recently where it's like millennials are ruining such and such thing. Have you seen those? Like, millennials aren't buying houses anymore.
They're ruining wine. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, they're ruining deodorant. Like, every day it's like this thing, millennials or whatever. So, I mean, the thing about that is that, like, it doesn't say all millennials, first of all, right? So, but secondly, if you start reading those articles, especially the ones about like housing and stuff, they say, oh, millennials aren't buying houses like they used to. And then they give you this chart. But like, most of the time what they're giving you is like white millennials, right? Like, and there is a whole different socioeconomic average between white millennials, Asian millennials, Latino millennials, black millennials, right? There's all that different kind of socioeconomic history. So that article, even though it says, millennials are blah, 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 they're really talking mostly about white millennials. They're mostly talking about a trend among white millennials that has slowed down. Because, like, for instance, the buying of houses thing, that's pretty much flat when it comes to black millennials. Like, there's no change. So they're not really part of that story. However, so that's a story that's more specifically about white millennials than anybody else. But that the headline just says millennials. But if they're talking about black people specifically, like, it's pretty much always going to include the word black in the headline. You know what I mean? Like, so you get, I think what I was trying to say earlier is you get used to being called out as what you are, because that's how everybody around you communicates about these things, right? Like, if there's something specifically happening in the Asian community, like we are being admitted to colleges at a higher rate now than we were 10 years ago, you're never going to see a headline that says Americans are being admitted to college in higher numbers, right? Like, it's always going to say Asian Americans. And that's just not true for white people. So again, like, I think that goes a long way towards making it feel like a threat, I guess, when you call out someone's race. Whereas for minority populations, it's just kind of like, that's just kind of how we've always seen people be talked about. But it's just that when we talk about it, we don't follow the convention that omitting the words white people when you mean specifically white people. But we don't follow that convention like, websites and newspapers still do, because it kind of doesn't make any sense. Like, if you're not talking about me, then why try to pretend like you are, I guess. And a lot of times too, and I'll just kind of say this, like, when mentioning a majority population, what you're really saying is, I'm not including the minority population here. So if straight people do this thing that is offensive to queer people, but they're not really realizing they're doing it, you say straight people do such and such. And it's not necessarily that you're saying straight people are terrible because they say this thing. What you're saying is queer people don't say this thing because they have an experience that allows them to understand right off the bat why that would be insensitive. So in a sense, you're not saying like all straight people. What you're saying is no queer people, blah, blah, blah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think so.
These are advanced linguistic concepts. They're not advanced, but they are. Like, a lot of what I think about is about linguistics and media analysis. And so that's where a lot of this stuff comes from for me.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way, gosh, we've been going a long time. We should probably cut this off soon, but maybe we can do the advanced level, like the senior level course another time. But it is interesting. I mean, even if you look at, I definitely find language interesting, but when we watch like 13th, and it's very clearly nothing in the amendment says that there's nothing written into the 13th Amendment that would say that we're going to put more black people in jail or anything like that.
Right,
but the system sort of wound up twisting itself into that. So like the language seems totally fine on its face, but in practice, people had other ideas.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, if you say certain things within the momentum of the system that's already created, like it's going to come off as different for different people within the system. Right. So if the system is already anti-black, generalizing black people as one thing or another is more likely to lead to violence and oppression towards them than if you say white people are something, because there isn't that kind of systemic gun pointed at white people's head.
Yeah. Oh, it's a lot to think about.
It is. It's a ton. I mean, this is why I never run out of tweets, is because there's always, it's not that there's always something to say, but there's always something to have a conversation around, Yeah.
Oh, I get it. And I don't know. I often say to myself, like, I'd like to talk more about these things, and I'll start tweeting about this and that, and I just never quite get around to it. But I'm glad people are, because I like reading the conversations when I get on there, and I like seeing. I really do feel like it's been educational, and there's a lot of darkness on Twitter.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a really, I've heard many a person call it just a toxic environment, and I think.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's true, but you could also say that about just like the YouTube comments section.
We're living in a toxic environment.
Well, yeah. Yeah, it's true. The world is a toxic environment at this point.
It's the anonymity of the internet has brought us a lot of wonderful things, but also a lot of abuses. But if you spend enough time where you get better at filtering that and start ignoring some of the just complete bullshit that's out there, then we can find some pretty cool stuff that can really teach us something. And
it's true.
That's what I feel I've gotten from you and a few others on Twitter too. So thank you for that. Now,
that. Yeah.
Are you mad at us?
You mean more mad? Like, because I'm just mad at white people baseline, right? So you more than that? Right. I'm just kidding. Sorry.
I mean,
no.
Where
of course not. What?
Where are you at like that? I mean, do you try to avoid any? Do you avoid white people? I mean, I'll just ask that because when as you're dealing with these issues and you start to get to know more people and people of color and these communities throughout the internet, and you guys meet in person and you do podcasts and all that. I mean, do you find yourself secluding yourself more from, if we must call it, the majority population? But it is. So how does that work in your life now?
Okay. Sometimes, like, there have been times where I'm like, I can't hang out with white people tonight because it's not because of white people per se. It's because, like, they're like, among everybody of every type of group, there is a certain amount of, I guess, background that you can expect from someone. So I've told you the story, I think, about how when I still lived in San Diego, I had my wife and I had these friends that we were really close with for over 10 years. And we went over to their place for dinner at one point, and they were essentially talking about how they were very uncomfortable that I was having black people on the show, and they wanted me to have fewer black people.
No, I don't think you told me that story before. You might have tweeted about it. And these I guess these I didn't see that one.
They're like very, very proud of how liberal they are, and their point was when black people were on the show, they were being very racist against white people. And I could tell you what episodes they're talking about, and they're not. Like, there's not at all any racism against. There's not even any shit talking or insults against white people. It's just that they were whatever. You can kind of listen for yourself. But anyway, so these are people who consider their favorite thing to do is talk shit about conservatives and talk about how liberal they are and how accepting they are and everything. But yet here they were telling me you should maybe have fewer black people on. And the thing is, at that point I had over 100 episodes and 3 of them had black people on them. I was bad with that stuff. Right. So,
yeah.
Those were people that I didn't expect, because of how liberal they said they were. I didn't expect them to be so uncomfortable with black people. And so what I've learned is it doesn't matter where on the political spectrum you say you are, your feelings about race are not necessarily tied to that. Kind of like you said earlier, a lot of racists are on the right side of the spectrum, but that doesn't mean that the left side is completely clean of this stuff. And it's not that they're so much sitting there thinking I hate black people. It's just that their bubble of liberalism, listening to NPR and whatever else, didn't prepare them to be conversational with black people. It prepared them to look at black people and say, I care about you as much as other people and I accept you into our society. But it didn't prepare them to actually kind of listen to what black people were saying conversationally. Right. So, man, I got a little bit far off from your question. Oh, okay. So that was a huge bummer. We're in the middle of dinner and that conversation is being had. And to them, it wasn't something uncomfortable to bring up. They didn't think that was going to end the dinner party, right? They were just kind of staying it in this kind of matter of fact way. And it made me really uncomfortable for the entire rest of the time I was there. And I was kind of telling my wife at the time, who's now my ex-wife, I was kind of telling her I kind of want to go now. Like, after we had finished eating dinner. And she was like, why? I don't see anything wrong with anything that's happening. And I'm like, well, I'm really uncomfortable. And later on, they said something about Asian people that was really, this is the same dinner where the husband of the couple said to me, and he meant this to be a compliment or something, but he was like, I've never thought of you as being Asian. I've just thought of you as being normal. And I was like, what? So Asian is not normal.
That's a weird thing to say. Okay.
Well, again, it goes back to this whole idea of like, when you talk about white people, you don't have to say white people. You could just say people, and that's what counts as quote unquote normal people. And so in your head, it gets confused into this thing of being like, well, white is normality, right? Whiteness is default. Whiteness is normal. But I accept anything that deviates from whiteness because I'm so open-minded. But really, like, you're coming from a place already where you're considering whiteness as like this thing that's kind of overarching everything else. But anyway, so yeah, that's still kind of one of the things that's like most offended me that any left-leaning person has said to my face. Cause I'm like, you don't like the fact that I didn't just like punch him in the face and leave at that moment. Like, I feel like is actually pretty like laudable on my part, but I had to stay in that apartment for another 3 hours hanging out with them. You know what I mean? And like the whole time that I was there, it was uncomfortable for me, but because the person I was with didn't kind of understand like how uncomfortable it was, and the people who were hosting us didn't understand like how kind of offensive or insensitive that stuff could be and how unsafe it made me feel ultimately. Because they didn't understand that, like I was just kind of trapped, because so I was telling my wife like, oh, we should go. And they're like, well, no, their feelings are going to get hurt if we go. And it's hard for me to argue with that because I for whatever reason, like their feelings become a concern, but me being uncomfortable for the next 3 hours is not a concern. You know what I mean? Like, it's really interesting where the emotional labor gets placed. So I guess that's what I'm saying is that like, sometimes it's too much emotional labor because I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I'm constantly being like, is this happening because this is a white person? Is this happening because they're just having a bad day? Is this happening like not making the determination, like having to continually wonder about what this person's mindset is really, really taxing. Like, it's really tiring. And some days I don't have enough, I just don't have enough juice to deal with it, especially if I've been getting death threats from white people all day on Twitter, which happens occasionally.
That happens. See, we've never gotten a single death threat, babe.
I'm usually not posting things.
I've said some shitty things, and I've even hashtag stuff MAGA, and I've never gotten a death threat from some fucking redneck Nazi.
Well, no, the worst one that I've ever gotten was from a liberal white person, because I had a tweet about free speech, and people will come at you from both sides of the spectrum on that stuff. But this is like a very like, I'm like hashtag still with her. And like, if you look at their tweets, they're all about like, being proud to be a Democrat and all this stuff. And the DM was, or no, this was a tweet. This was an actual tweet. It wasn't a death threat per se, but it said, I wish your ancestors had died in Manzanar. You guys know what Manzanar is?
No.
Manzanar was one of the worst internment camps. It was one of the ones where like there was some real bad shit going down.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, and that's pretty hardcore. Like, I get a lot of ones where it's like, I wish your family had died in Hiroshima and that kind of stuff. Like that stuff doesn't necessarily bother me. Like, the reason why the Manzanar one bothered me is because like this person had an actual sense of history, or they had to Google it to like come up with like this very specific insult. Yeah. And,
I feel like those are it has to make somebody like a sociopath or some. I just don't understand how people can be so idiotic.
I'm telling you, the internet brings out the worst in people.
What?
It's the worst. Because it's people will say shit like that. They would never say that. If you met that guy on the street, he would never say that to your face. If you guys were having a heated conversation about the First Amendment, he would never be like, God, I wish your ancestors had died. Yeah. Like, he would never say that. I don't know that I've ever met anyone who would say that to someone's face, but on the internet, that's just par for the course now.
I think it's not only because of anonymity, but it's also because of like how fast something can go from your brain to your fingers.
Yeah, that's true.
When you get Like, you get personally offended at a tweet that I've written about free speech. Like, when you take that personally, like, your response and reaction can just be like instantaneous, you know? I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why the best thing you can ever do on something like Twitter is to try really hard not to take anything personally. And if you find that you can't do that, then make sure that you always take a little bit of time before you reply to something, you know, and that'll really improve your experience. It's not something that everyone can do, I guess, but it can certainly just make everything better for you.
Wow.
But it's hard. I mean, it's Twitter especially will eat you alive. You have to be like sensitive enough, but not too sensitive, and like it's just a lot. You learn a lot about yourself.
Just in the context of even your dinner party story of having liberal friends that are kind of saying really shocking things, but it makes my mind spin off in a million different directions. But I think, I think we've had a great conversation, and I'm hoping we can do this again, because I'd love to talk about stuff ranging from like stand-up comedy and Cards Against Humanity, or some of the other things that well-meaning people do. Right. And I'd just like to hear some other takes on that, and see, pick your brain a little bit, see what you think, and
I think the main thing, like one thing that's really helpful, is you think about what makes other people feel kind of legitimately unsafe. Because we're not really trained to think that way. But if you kind of think about that, that tends to cover a lot of this stuff. Like, it tends to really help you understand perspectives outside your own when you're thinking about someone else's safety. And I think both of you would be kind of already practiced at that, having children, right? So,
well, how does a bigger, blacker dick make you feel?
You're just pulling that one out. There's the random.
I was trying to think of the most offensive Cards Against Humanity.
That's probably not the most offensive Cards Against Humanity.
That's the one I could think of.
I mean, we could go into that. It's interesting, because that's another myth that gets created to make it okay to kill black people. Interesting.
No, he's right. He's right. We
saw
that art exhibit. It was, we saw that one all about that. I can't remember what it was called now, so I guess I won't get into it. But yeah, I mean, it's
so interesting.
So many topics. So let's do the advanced class sometime, Sean. What do you say?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. And in the meantime,
advanced as far as I know. There's a ton of stuff I don't know.
You know what? We know you. So how about that?
Right.
Like,
okay.
There's lots of people I don't know. Believe it or not, there's a lot of people I don't know.
No.
But you seem like a good source of information, both from your perspective, but you also have been talking to so many people too, that I think you've taken in a lot of different perspectives, and I think that's great. So until that time comes, what we haven't talked a lot about, you do have a podcast called No Totally, which hasn't podcasted, I guess, in a while, but it's not dead,
coming
right?
Back soon. No, coming back soon. We're going to be a slightly different format. People can listen. Just search on whatever podcast place you go to, search No Totally, and you should find it.
All right. And you're at No Totally on Twitter, and you have other projects that you often allude to, but if we pay attention and follow you on Twitter and listen to the show, then we'll find out more about those things as they continue to develop, right?
Correct. Yeah.
All right.
Twitter is where you'll basically find all the information all the time.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us, Sean. Again, I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. No, thanks. Yeah. Thanks again for having me on. Yeah. Like I said, I love you guys. I like talking to you, and this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was fun for me too.
I concur.